Have you ever stopped in the middle of a really mundane task, like maybe you're folding laundry or driving to the grocery store, and suddenly realized that you are having a full-blown, intense argument with someone, only to realize that the person you're arguing with is, well, yourself? Like, have you ever noticed that the person you talk to the most in your entire life, by a massive margin, is you?
It's just a relentless, continuous stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, from the moment we wake up, sometimes even weaving its way into our dreams, there's this narrator that simply does not stop talking.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of The Brain Hole, where we talk about any and everything. Today, we are taking a massive deep dive into a stack of sources you sent over for an exploration we're calling The Voice That Won't Shut Up.
Yeah, and it really doesn't, does it?
No, it never does. And our mission today is to completely dissect this phenomenon of inner speech. Like, what is it mechanically? How does this invisible dialogue actually shape the physical, tangible reality you experience every single day? And the ultimate goal for this deep dive is we're going to look at the hard neurobiological evidence of how you can literally, physically rewire the hardware of your brain by changing the specific vocabulary of your internal dialogue.
When you put it like that, it almost sounds like science fiction.
Whoa.
You know, the idea that words, just these ephemeral thoughts, can alter biological tissue. But the stack of literature you've provided for us today outlines an incredibly robust neurological framework that proves exactly that.
It is a huge stack, and I want to explicitly name every single source we are pulling from today so that you can look them up, read the methodology for yourself, and follow along. So we are drawing from D. McMillan's research notes and audio script for The Brain Hole. We also have a paper titled Enhancing Psychotherapy Outcomes by Unifying Science and Practice by Mary Jane Coy. And we're pulling heavily from this brilliant dissertation titled Evaluation of Neuroplastic Changes in Psychological Intervention and Contemporary Treatments of Depression, which comes to us from the Digital Commons at NLU.
And to back up the biological claims, we are diving into some very heavy-hitting neuroimaging studies.
Oh yeah, the MRI stuff is wild.
It really is. We have change in emotional self-concept following sociocognitive training relates to structural plasticity of the prefrontal cortex by Luma and colleagues, which, by the way, is a major component of the widely respected resource project. We're also breaking down a study called Neuroplasticity in Response to Cognitive Behavior Therapy for Social Anxiety Disorder by Monson and Associates. And finally, we'll be looking at an article focusing on affirmations from the Research Journal for Social Affairs.
It is a lot of ground to cover. And as always, we invite you to look up and fact-check absolutely anything we discuss today. We are just here to report on the original source material you provided. And remember, you might not always like the facts. They might even make you a bit uncomfortable as you evaluate your own inner dialogue. However, the facts are the facts.
They absolutely are. And the facts about how the physical structures of our brains react to our own private thoughts, well, they're going to challenge a lot of assumptions. I mean, we tend to think of the mind and the brain as two separate entities, right?
Right, like the mind is this abstract, cloudy thing, and the brain is the physical organ.
Exactly. But these sources completely shatter that illusion.
So I want to start by looking at D. McMillan's notes, because they lay this great foundation for what we even mean when we say inner speech. The notes clarify that this isn't like some sort of pathology or disorder. Inner speech is simply the brain talking to itself.
Yeah, it serves completely essential everyday functions.
Right, like we use it for planning our day, solving complex problems, rehearsing difficult conversations before we have them, and monitoring our own behavior. It's the voice that pops up to say, hey, don't forget to grab the milk, or, if I phrase this email to my boss this way, it might sound too aggressive.
What I found most compelling in the initial research you shared is the underlying biological mechanism of this everyday function. I think the average person assumes that thinking silently to yourself must use a completely different, perhaps more primitive brain system than physically speaking out loud to another human being.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought.
But neurolinguistics proves that is entirely false. Your brain actually recruits the exact same language processing centers for inner speech that it uses for audible out loud speech.
Wait, really? So when I'm silently ranting in my head while taking a shower, my brain physiologically thinks I'm talking?
Down to the microscopic level, yes. I mean, the primary areas involved are Broca's area and Wernicke's area.
Let me jump in here because I was reading up on Broca's area in the notes. It's located in the frontal lobe, right?
Correct.
And usually its primary job is language production. So it handles forming the actual words, organizing the grammar and syntax, and then physically sending the signals to coordinate the muscles of your mouth, your tongue, and your vocal cords so you can actually speak.
Precisely. It is the motor speech command center. But what functional MRI scans reveal, and this is truly mind-blowing, is that Broca's area is highly metabolically active even when your lips are completely sealed and you are only speaking internally.
That's just so weird to think about.
It is. Your brain is essentially generating the exact electrical impulses required to speak out loud, but there is this inhibitory mechanism that intercepts the signal just milliseconds before it actually triggers the muscle contractions in your throat.
Okay, so it's like pressing the accelerator on a car while holding the emergency brake. The engine is revving, the command to move is there, but the physical action is suppressed.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. And then you have Wernicke's area, which sits a bit further back in the temporal lobe. Its primary role is language comprehension, understanding what words mean.
Right, so decoding the sounds.
Exactly. So in the context of inner speech, Broca's area is firing to help you put your internal thought together, and Wernicke's area is firing to help you instantly comprehend the thought you just generated. It forms this incredibly fast, highly integrated loop of communication entirely contained within your own skull.
So you are literally broadcasting and receiving a signal simultaneously.
Yes, you are your own speaker and audience.
But there's another layer to this in the notes, something broader than just the language centers. D. McMillian spends a lot of time talking about the default mode network, or the DMN. I've seen this term pop up a lot in neuroscience articles lately.
The DMN is absolutely crucial to understanding inner speech. To step back and look at the whole picture, the brain operates in different network states. When you are highly focused on an external task, say doing a math equation or parallel parking, your brain engages its executive control networks.
Because it needs all that outward attention.
Right. But the moment you finish that task and your attention drifts away from the outside world, a different set of interacting brain regions takes over. That is the default mode network.
So it's what happens when the brain is basically at rest.
Well, I wouldn't call it at rest because it's incredibly active, but it's internally focused. The DMN lights up like a Christmas tree when we are daydreaming, when we are retrieving memories from our past, when we are envisioning future scenarios, and crucially, when we are monitoring our own emotional state and sense of self.
And the notes use a specific term for this, metacognition.
Yes, metacognition. It literally translates to thinking about thinking. The DMN is the neurological stage where metacognition takes place.
It's so meta.
It is. It allows us to step outside of our immediate sensory experience, monitor our own thoughts, judge our past decisions, and plan how we want to adjust our behavior in the future. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is a spectacular survival tool. It allows humans to simulate reality without having to actually experience the consequences.
Okay, so D. McMillian provided this incredibly helpful brain hole translation guide in the source material, which I loved because it takes these dense neurological concepts and gives them highly relatable labels.
I thought that was a great addition to the notes.
Yeah, the guide categorizes the different types of internal sounds we experience, pointing out that not all inner speech serves the same function.
It's a vital distinction, really. If we don't differentiate between the types of inner speech, we can't understand how they impact our biology differently.
Exactly. So the guide breaks it down into 4 main categories. First, we have standard inner speech, which the guide calls the narrator. That is the healthy, functional planning and metacognition we just talked about.
It's organized, it's productive, and it generally moves you forward.
Right. But then we have the second category, rumination. The guide labels this the broken record. This is when the DMN gets stuck in a loop.
And we've all been there.
Oh, constantly. It's the constant replay of a regretful moment, a fear about the future, or just chronic self-criticism. Then the third category is intrusive thoughts, which McMillian calls the unwanted guest.
Those can be really jarring.
Totally. These are those sudden, bizarre, and often disturbing ideas or images that just crash into your consciousness without any invitation.
And it's important to note, everyone experiences intrusive thoughts to some degree. It's essentially the brain throwing a random high-threat scenario at you to see if you're prepared, even if it's completely irrational.
And finally, the fourth category is auditory hallucinations, termed the voice outside the room. This is when the internal voice bypasses that sense of self-generation we talked about earlier, and the brain genuinely perceives the internal thought as an external sound coming from outside the body.
Right, that lexicon is a fantastic tool because it separates the normative function of the brain from the dysfunction of the brain. But focusing back on the first two, the narrator and the broken record, this raises a profound question about origin. I mean, we know where in the brain this voice happens, but whose voice is it, really?
Well, it's my voice, right? Like, it's my brain.
The hardware is yours, absolutely. But the research strongly suggests that the specific vocabulary, the tone, and the cadence of that inner voice are not created in isolation. Human beings are not born with an innate vocabulary.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Your inner speech is, in many ways, an echo chamber. Throughout your cognitive development, especially during childhood and early adolescence, your brain's primary job is to absorb linguistic patterns from the environment.
So it's basically recording everything.
Precisely. Your inner voice is painstakingly constructed from the external voices you are surrounded by. It is a mosaic of parents, teachers, older siblings, coaches, bullies, and friends. The brain records these extrinsic verbal experiences, how people spoke to you when you succeeded, how they spoke to you when you failed, and it internalizes them as a physiological program.
So you're saying if I drop a glass in the kitchen and my immediate internal reaction is a voice screaming, "You are so incredibly stupid, you ruin everything," that isn't necessarily my soul speaking to me. That is a learned linguistic pattern.
Highly likely. It is an echo of a past external stimulus that your brain coded as the appropriate response to a mistake.
Okay, I have to push back on this a little bit, or at least play devil's advocate,
Yeah.
because if you take that to its logical conclusion, if my inner voice is just a mashup of a stressed out parent, a highly critical middle school math teacher, and an overly intense soccer coach, is it even my voice at all? I mean, it makes me feel like a tape recorder just playing back other people's baggage.
That is the existential crux of the issue. It is a deeply unsettling realization for a lot of people. Genetically and neurologically, the gray and white matter generating the thought belongs to you. But the software, the specific operating system of vocabulary and tone your brain uses to interpret your daily reality, was heavily programmed by your external environment before you had the cognitive ability to filter it.
That brings me back to the default mode network. When I was reading the notes on how the DMN activates when we aren't focused on a task, I kept picturing a car left idling in the driveway. The car isn't in gear, it's not driving down the road, but the engine is still on, it's burning gas, the pistons are firing, and it's making a lot of noise.
Yes, the brain is never truly off.
Right, but here is where that gets tricky based on what you just said about the echo chamber. If the engine noise of my idling brain is constructed from a bunch of old, highly critical, negative voices, then that idling car isn't just making neutral noise, it starts to feel toxic. It's like the exhaust from the idling cart is leaking directly into the cabin.
I love that refinement of the analogy because it is neurologically accurate. When the DMN is in its idling state, it doesn't just invent new thoughts out of thin air. It defaults to the most deeply ingrained, most heavily myelinated neural pathways available.
So it takes the path of least resistance.
Exactly. If your foundational pathways were paved with negative, critical language, then your baseline idling state, your default mode, is going to be a state of stress.
Which perfectly explains why someone can be sitting on a beautiful beach, totally safe, with nothing to do, and feel an overwhelming sense of dread. Their idling engine is pumping out toxic exhaust.
That's exactly it. And this bridges us directly into the consequences of that exhaust. We've established that the narrator is a normal function utilizing Broca and Wernicke's areas in the DMN. But what happens biologically when that narrator turns into the broken record? What happens when that idling exhaust starts seeping into the rest of the house?
Yeah, and looking at the NLU dissertation on neuroclastic changes in depression, this is where we pivot from linguistics into the hard biology of anxiety. The dissertation makes it incredibly clear that the broken record isn't just an emotional nuisance. When your inner speech is stuck on a loop of self-criticism, fear, or regret, your brain perceives that language as an active, imminent threat. And the center of that threat detection is the amygdala.
The amygdala is an ancient, almond-shaped cluster of nuclei located deep within the temporal lobe. Evolutionarily, it is our alarm system. Its primary function is to scan the environment for danger, process fear, and trigger the body's survival mechanisms.
But the environment it's scanning isn't just the physical room I'm sitting in, it's scanning my internal environment too.
And that is the fatal flaw in the system. The amygdala is incredibly fast, but it is not particularly smart in a logical sense. It cannot easily distinguish between a physical threat, like a predator walking into the room, and an internal linguistic threat, like your inner voice telling you that you're going to be fired and lose your house.
Wow, so it reacts the exact same way to both.
It does. In individuals suffering from chronic depression or social anxiety, the amygdala becomes hyperactive and hypersensitive.
It was constantly ringing the alarm bell.
Constantly. It is retrieving emotionally charged negative memories, projecting them into the future, and dumping stress hormones into your bloodstream. And because the threat is coming from inside the house, from your own inner speech, you can never run away from it. The alarm just keeps ringing, reinforcing the negative emotional processing loop.
I want to dig into what happens to the rest of the brain when that alarm never shuts off, because the collateral damage described in the NLU paper is, frankly, terrifying. The paper focuses heavily on the prefrontal cortex, which is basically the brain's CEO.
Yes, the prefrontal cortex, located right at the front of the frontal lobe, is responsible for executive functions. That includes high-level logical reasoning, goal-directed behavior, emotional regulation, and cognitive flexibility.
And cognitive flexibility is what exactly?
Cognitive flexibility is your ability to see a problem from multiple different angles and adapt your thinking.
Oh, okay, so you have the amygdala, the panic alarm, and the prefrontal cortex, the logical CEO. What happens when they clash? The paper says that chronic negative inner speech and the resulting constant amygdala activation actually diminishes the prefrontal cortex.
Diminishes pretty mildly, honestly. The NLU research specifies that chronic depression, fueled by these negative thought loops, leads to actual synaptic atrophy in the prefrontal cortex.
Okay, I need you to break down synaptic atrophy for me. Are we talking about the brain actually shrinking?
In a very literal sense, yes. Think of the neurons in your prefrontal cortex like trees in a forest. To communicate with each other, these trees grow thousands of tiny branches, which we call dendritic spines. These spines form the synapses, the connections that allow complex logical thought to occur. When the amygdala is constantly firing, it causes a chronic flood of cortisol, a primary stress hormone. While cortisol is helpful in short bursts to give you energy to run from danger, chronic exposure to high levels of cortisol is physically toxic to the brain.
So the cortisol is like acid rain falling on the forest.
That is exactly what it is.
Yeah.
The acid rain causes those tiny branches, the dendritic spines, to literally wither and retract. The connections between the neurons shrink. We see a measurable reduction in neuronal spine density and an overall drop in metabolic activity in the prefrontal cortex.
That is so intense.
It is. The CEO is essentially locked out of the building, and their desk is being dismantled because the security alarm downstairs won't shut off.
And the behavioral result of that is that cognitive flexibility drops to zero. You literally lose the biological hardware required to logically think your way out of the anxiety. You can't see other perspectives because the synapses required to process those perspectives have withered away.
You become trapped in a tunnel vision of survival. And this systemic impact doesn't just stop at the brain. To fully understand the cascade, we have to look at the autonomic nervous system, which is where Mary Jane Coy's research on the polyvagal theory comes into the picture.
Okay, I was taking a lot of notes on Coy's paper because the polyvagal theory was a totally new framework for me. Let me see if I can explain this and you correct me where I go wrong.
That's good.
The autonomic nervous system, the ANS, is the control center for all the involuntary things keeping us alive, like heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, digestion. And Coy argues that our linguistic stimuli, our inner speech, directly drives the ANS.
You're spot on so far. The words you use internally act as command codes for your cardiovascular and respiratory systems.
Right. And she breaks down the polyvagal theory, which was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, to explain how this works. It's not just a simple on-off switch for stress. The theory outlines 3 distinct branches or pathways of the nervous system. The first is the sympathetic nervous system. That's our classic fight or flight response.
Okay.
So if a threat is perceived, but the brain thinks it's manageable, like having to slam on the brakes in traffic, this system kicks in, spikes the heart rate, and mobilizes you to act.
Correct. It's highly activating.
But then there's the second branch, the dorsal vagal complex. Coy notes this is an older evolutionary pathway that triggers an immobilization or freeze response. This happens when a threat feels entirely overwhelming and inescapable. It literally drops your heart rate, suppresses digestion, and causes you to dissociate or shut down.
Yeah, think of a mouse playing dead when caught by a cat. It's a last-ditch survival mechanism.
And then the third branch is the ventral vagal complex. This is the newest pathway, evolutionarily speaking, and it is the state of physiological safety, social connection, and calm. This is where your heart rate is regulated, you can digest food properly, and you can engage with other people openly.
And the brilliance of connecting polyvagal theory to inner speech is looking at the biochemical implications here. When your inner speech is a broken record of highly critical, negative, or panic-inducing statements, saying things like, "I'm a failure," or "everything is going to fall apart," your brain interprets that as a severe threat.
Because it can't tell the difference between the word and a real threat.
Exactly. Depending on the intensity, it activates either the sympathetic fight or flight state or the dorsal vagal freeze state.
And both of those states dump that toxic cortisol we talked about.
Right. You are chemically bathing your brain in stress hormones just by thinking specific words. But the incredible flip side to this mechanism is that the reverse is perfectly true.
Which is what?
Positive declarations, supportive internal dialogue, and language that promotes feelings of autonomy and safety act as the precise biological key to activate the ventral vagal complex. Yeah. When you shift your language to signal safety, the amygdala quiets down. This triggers the release of a completely different set of neurochemicals like dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. These chemicals not only reduce stress, but they actually enhance brain function. They promote neurogenesis, which is the growth of brand new neurons, and they reinforce and strengthen the synaptic connections in that prefrontal cortex.
I just want to pause for a second because I want this to sink in for the listener and honestly for myself. You're saying that saying mean, critical things to myself doesn't just hurt my feelings in some abstract psychological way. It is literally physically shrinking the CEO of my brain, destroying synaptic branches, and beefing up the panic alarm system.
That is the unvarnished neurobiological reality.
Yeah.
You are structurally changing the landscape of your brain based on the vocabulary of your internal monologue.
It's like having a smoke detector, the amygdala, that starts going off every single time you make toast. It gets so hypersensitive that you eventually become terrified of walking into your own kitchen. And while you are huddled in the living room panicking about the toast, the CEO of your house is slowly shrinking in the corner because you aren't using logic anymore. You're just existing in pure survival mode.
That is a phenomenal analogy for the pathology of an anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
The brain learns through repetition that negativity and threat vigilance is the primary mode of existence.
Yeah.
And because of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to adapt to whatever it does most often, the lesson becomes hardwired into the tissue.
So this is the million-dollar question, and it takes us right into the core of Mary Jane Coy's work. If we know, as a matter of biological fact, that negative words cause physical brain damage and positive words promote synaptic growth, how do we actually fix it? How do we use specific language to repair the damage and remodel the house?
Well, this is where Coy introduces a protocol called NLPR, which stands for Neuro-Linguistic Processing and Reprogramming.
NLPR. I want to be very clear about this for anyone listening who might be skeptical, because when I first saw the term reprogramming, I thought this was going to be some fluffy, toxic positivity stuff, just stand in front of a mirror and say, "I am a tiger," 10 times.
Right, a lot of people assume that.
But reading the paper, it is incredibly clinical. It is a proactive psychotherapeutic intervention that uses highly precise, almost rigid language guidelines to manually force the brain out of the threat state and regulate the nervous system.
It is not about thinking happy thoughts. It is about physiological manipulation through syntax.
Let's go through Coy's specific NLPR language guidelines because they are fascinating and immediately actionable. The first guideline is mandating the use of I statements.
This sounds simple, but it is deeply foundational. Often, when people talk about their own uncomfortable experiences or internal struggles, they unconsciously switch to the second person. They say things like, when you go to a party and you feel totally out of place and you just want to leave.
Oh man, I do that constantly. I think almost everyone does.
We do it because it serves a function. Coy points out that using the word you when discussing your own internal experience is a linguistic defense mechanism. It is triggered by the brain's threat detection system.
Really? Just using the word you?
Yes. By projecting the feeling onto a generalized you, it creates psychological distance from the self. It is a subtle form of dissociation from the discomfort.
Oh, I see. You're trying to prove that it's a universal problem so you don't have to bear the weight of it alone.
Exactly. But neurologically, that dissociation keeps you in a mild state of threat avoidance. NLPR demands that you catch that habit and redirect it. You must say, "When I go to a party, I feel out of place and I want to leave."
That feels so much more vulnerable.
It does, but it forces the brain to stay connected to the body. Owning the experience grounds the nervous system and establishes internal functional safety, which allows the prefrontal cortex to actually process the emotion rather than just avoiding it.
Okay, the second guideline is redirecting the word should. as in, I should go to the gym or I should have finished that project yesterday.
The word should is arguably one of the most toxic words in our internal vocabulary.
Seriously, just the word should.
Yes, because it is inherently laden with negative judgment and implied failure. The moment your internal voice says I should, it instantly creates a standard you are currently failing to meet. This creates immediate psychological pressure, activates the sympathetic stress pathways, and shuts down the prefrontal cortex because it implies a state of lack or inadequacy.
Wow, so what is the alternative? How do I tell myself to go to the gym without using should?
NLPR suggests redirecting the syntax to emphasize autonomy, choice, and acceptance. Instead of I should exercise, you transition to it might be beneficial if I exercise, or I want to exercise, or I have the capacity to exercise.
Just hearing that shift out loud, it feels entirely different. I should exercise feels like a parent scolding me. I want to exercise feels like I'm the one making the choice.
And that feeling of choice is what shifts the brain out of threat detection. When you operate from a place of autonomy, you activate the ventral vagal pathways of safety. You open your prefrontal cortex up for exploration and discovery rather than defensiveness.
Guideline number 3 is banning the phrase I don't know when talking about the self. This one hit me like a ton of bricks. Coy writes that if a therapist asks you how you feel about something, or if you ask yourself why you are upset, and the immediate response is I don't know, it literally halts the entire discovery process.
It drops an iron curtain over the prefrontal cortex. Saying, I don't know about your own internal emotional state is almost always an avoidance behavior based on past programming. It's the brain saying, accessing this information is uncomfortable, so I am going to claim ignorance to shut down the inquiry.
So what are you supposed to do instead?
The required NLPR redirection is to force yourself to say, give me a minute to think, or let me take a second to check in with myself.
I was reading this and I immediately started pushing back in my head. Because honestly, this sounds incredibly tedious. Doesn't it feel completely artificial and fake to force yourself to say, I need a minute to think, when you're sitting there genuinely feeling like a blank slate, like you truly have no idea what is going on in your head?
Of course it feels artificial at first. It is a forced intervention. You aren't saying, give me a minute to be polite to the therapist or to yourself. You are doing it to manipulate your neurology.
To buy time for the brain.
Yes. By saying, give me a minute, you are creating temporal space. That linguistic space acts as a command to the prefrontal cortex, telling it to stay online, boot up the analytical pathways, and actively search for the answer internally, rather than just shutting down the system.
I was trying to figure out a way to visualize this, and the best analogy I could come up with is taking a really difficult math test in high school. You sit down, look at the paper, panic, and realize you don't know the answers. Saying I don't know in therapy is like pulling the fire alarm in the school hallway.
That is brilliant. Let's unpack that.
If you pull the fire alarm, it gets you out of the uncomfortable situation immediately. The test is canceled, you get to go outside, the immediate pressure is gone, it works in the short term.
Right.
But the problem is you never actually learn the math. You never engaged the logical part of your brain to solve the problem, you just relied on the panic system to escape.
Exactly. And if you pull the fire alarm every time you face a challenge, your brain forgets how to do math entirely. Banning, I don't know, is taking your hand off the fire alarm and forcing yourself to stare at the paper until the logic centers boot up. Let's look at the fourth guideline. Eliminating makes-me declarations.
Oh, the classic blame game. You make me so angry, or this email makes me anxious.
We hear it constantly.
Yeah.
But neurologically, makes-me language fundamentally strips you of your personal power. It implies strict external causation for your internal state.
So you're just a passenger.
It tells your brain that you are a passive victim to whatever is happening around you. NLPR requires you to shift this syntax to reclaim responsibility. Instead of you make me angry, the phrase becomes when you do X, I feel angry.
Which acknowledges that the anger is an internal reaction generated by my brain, not a physical object that someone else forced inside of me.
Precisely. It establishes an internal locus of control, which is highly correlated with emotional resilience and prefrontal cortex activation.
And the final major guideline we'll cover from Coy's paper is being gentle with self. This means shifting from harsh, absolute language like, I am an idiot, I can't believe I messed up again, to compassionate, relative language like, I made a mistake, I am disappointed, but that's okay. I can learn from this.
What's fascinating here is why self-compassion works on a biological level. A lot of people believe that being hard on themselves is necessary for motivation.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like
Yeah.
you need the drill sergeant yelling at you to get anything done.
Right. But harsh self-criticism adds immense emotional weight and pressure, which activates that dorsal vagal freeze state. You get stuck in shame. Being gentle with yourself isn't about letting yourself off the hook or avoiding accountability. It is about maintaining a state of physiological safety.
Because if you're safe, your brain works better.
Exactly. When you speak to yourself with grace, the prefrontal cortex remains fully active, which means you have the cognitive flexibility to analyze why you made the mistake and figure out how to avoid it next time.
Okay, let's pull all of this together because this is where the deep dive gets really profound. If I actually commit to this, like if I spend the next few months painstakingly policing my vocabulary, rewiring my syntax, changing my shoulds to coulds, banning, I don't know, taking responsibility for my feelings and showing myself grace, is there actual physical photographic proof that my brain will change shape?
Yes, there is overwhelming, peer-reviewed neuroimaging proof. Which brings us to the final portion of our sources. Structural neuroplasticity, the proof in the scans.
Rewiring the script, as D. McMillian calls it in the notes. We briefly touched on neuroplasticity earlier, but let's define it clearly. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize itself, both functionally and structurally, by forming new neural connections throughout life in response to learning, experience, or following injury. It's the mechanism of change. Let's look at the hard evidence. We have 3 major studies here. Let's start with the LUMA paper from the Resource Project.
The Resource Project is one of the most comprehensive, large-scale, longitudinal mental training studies ever conducted. Luma and her colleagues specifically looked at the neurological effects of a training block called the perspective module.
And reading through the methodology, this module was deeply rooted in manipulating inner speech. Participants engaged in an exercise called the perspective dyad. Can you explain how this works? From what I read, it sounded like it was heavily inspired by the internal family systems model.
It was. Internal family systems is a therapeutic model that suggests our psyche is made up of multiple distinct parts or subpersonalities.
Like the voices in the echo chamber.
Yes. For example, everyone has an inner critic, an inner child, maybe a manager or a perfectionist. In the perspective dyad, participants are trained to identify these inner parts. They then sit with a partner and literally practice taking the perspective of these different parts and speaking from their point of view.
So they are externalizing their inner speech. They are intentionally isolating the different voices in that echo chamber we talked about earlier and practicing taking control of them.
Exactly. It's highly targeted sociocognitive training. They are intentionally manipulating their emotional self-concept through linguistic exercises. And the researchers didn't just ask them how they felt afterward. They put them in MRI machines before and after the months of training.
And the results were stunning.
They were undeniable. By engaging in this specific linguistic and perspective-taking training, the participants actually increased the physical cortical thickness of their prefrontal cortices.
They grew their brains.
They did. Specifically, they saw massive growth in the right medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC.
They literally grew their brain's CEO. They added physical gray matter to the logic centers just by changing how they spoke about their inner parts.
They did. And the DLPFC is heavily involved in high-order cognitive control and emotion regulation. By consciously reappraising their emotional content through language, they demanded that their brain get better at processing emotions.
Yeah.
The brain responded by building physical infrastructure, new synapses, thicker gray matter in the exact areas needed to maintain that emotional control.
That is incredible. It's like doing bicep curls, but for your logic center. But let's look at the second study, which to me might be even more mind-blowing because it looks at the other side of the equation. This is the Monson study on cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, for social anxiety disorder.
This is a landmark study. Monson and his team took a group of patients diagnosed with severe social anxiety disorder and put them through a standard 9-week online cognitive behavior therapy program.
And CBT is fundamentally a linguistic therapy, right? It's about identifying negative thought patterns, your inner speech, and actively challenging and restructuring those thoughts.
Exactly. It is highly aligned with the NLPR guidelines we discussed. They compared this CBT group to a control group receiving attention bias modification. To measure the effects, they put the participants in an fMRI scanner both before the 9 weeks and after.
Okay.
While in the scanner, they subjected the participants to self-referential criticism. Essentially, they displayed negative, highly critical language targeted at the participant on a screen and watched how the brain reacted.
And they were specifically looking at the amygdala, the alarm system.
Yes. In fMRI, we measure something called the BOLD response, which stands for blood oxygen level dependent signal.
Okay, let's break that down for a second so I fully understand it.
Sure. When a specific area of the brain becomes highly active, it needs more energy, which means it needs more oxygen. Blood rushes to that area to deliver the oxygen. Because oxygenated blood has different magnetic properties than deoxygenated blood, the powerful magnets in the fMRI machine can actually detect where the blood is rushing in real time.
Oh, that's clever. So a high bold response in the amygdala means the amygdala is firing rapidly and aggressively.
Got it. So before the therapy, when these socially anxious patients read critical words about themselves, their amygdalas lit up like crazy. The blood rushed in, the alarm was blaring.
What happened after the 9 weeks of changing their inner speech through CBT?
Two profound things happened. First, the functional reactivity decreased. When subjected to the exact same critical words, the bold response in the amygdala was significantly lower. The alarm simply didn't ring as loudly.
Their brains learned that the words weren't a physical threat.
Yes. But the second finding is the structural one. The MRI scans revealed that the CDT successfully decreased the physical gray matter volume of the amygdala. The alarm system literally shrank in size.
I have to pause on this. We always hear in neuroscience news that bigger is better when it comes to brain matter. We want a thick prefrontal cortex. We want a large hippocampus for memory. But this study shows the amygdala shrank. Is this a good thing?
It's an amazing thing.
Is this like realizing you've overtrained a muscle you don't actually want? Like realizing your stress muscle is way too jacked from carrying anxiety all day?
That is the perfect way to look at it. In an untreated anxiety disorder, the amygdala is hypertrophic. It is overworked, overstimulated, and structurally oversized because it is constantly being exercised by negative inner speech. Effective linguistic therapy acts like a targeted resting period for that specific muscle, allowing it to atrophy back down to a normal, healthy baseline size.
I noticed the study mentioned something called a mediation analysis, and I want to make sure we explain this because it seems crucial to proving the point.
It is the most important part of the paper. In statistical research, when you have an intervention like CBT and an outcome like reduced anxiety, you can't always be sure the intervention directly caused the outcome. A mediation analysis tests whether a middle variable, a mediator, is the actual cause.
Okay, so what was the mediator here?
The physical shrinking of the amygdala's volume. The statistical analysis proved that the reduction in the patient's social anxiety didn't just happen by magic. It wasn't just a placebo effect. The anxiety decreased because the physical structure of the fear center got smaller.
Wow.
The structural change was the direct mechanism for the psychological healing.
That gives me chills. The words they used to reshape their thoughts physically reshaped the tissue, which in turn cured the anxiety. It's like neuroplasticity is hiking a trail in the woods.
How do you mean?
Well, think about it. The negative thought loop, that rumination we talked about in the beginning, it's like a deep, heavily paved highway through the forest of your brain. It's so easy and frictionless for your brain to drive down it.
Right. It's the default mode.
Yes. So when you first start using this new NLPR positive language, forcing yourself to say, I want to, instead of I should, it's like stepping off the highway and trying to hack through thick, overgrown brush with a dull machete.
It's exhausting, and it requires intense executive control.
Exactly. It is incredibly hard at first. But if you walk that new path every single day, tamping down the dirt, cutting back the branches, it slowly becomes a clear trail. And because you are spending all your time on the new trail, you aren't driving on the old highway anymore. Eventually, the new trail becomes the new default highway, and that old negative highway gets completely overgrown with weeds and shrinks away into nothing.
That is exactly what happens at the synaptic level. We call it long-term potentiation and long-term depression.
Oh, interesting terms.
Yeah, so the more you use a neural circuit, the new trail, the stronger and faster it becomes, which is potentiation. And the less you use the old circuit, the old highway, the weaker it gets, until those synapses actually disconnect, which is depression. It is a highly efficient system. Use it or lose it.
Which brings us to our final piece of evidence, which looks at the chemical fertilizer that helps build that new trail. This is the article from the Research Journal for Social Affairs focusing on affirmations and the VMPFC.
Right. This study looked at patients suffering from multiple sclerosis. MS is obviously an incredibly stressful, unpredictable, and difficult chronic illness. The researchers wanted to see how intentional, positive self-talk, affirmations, affected their brain function and stress levels.
And the paper is quick to clarify that they aren't talking about empty, toxic positivity. They aren't telling MS patients to just smile through the pain.
No, not at all. They are talking about affirmations rooted in fundamental core beliefs, values-based language, and genuine self-comforting behaviors. Things like, I am resilient, or I have handled difficult days before, and I can handle this one.
And what did they find?
The fMRI data show that practicing these specific affirmations increased blood flow and activity in a region called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC.
What does the VMPFC do?
It is essentially the brain's evaluation and self-processing center. It helps us assign value and meaning to our experiences. When the VMPFC is highly active through positive self-reflection, it triggers a cascade of neurochemicals, the most important of which is called BDNF.
BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. I've read about this in the context of intense exercise.
Yes, exercise produces it as well. Think of BDNF as high-grade miracle ground, or fertilizer for the brain. When you use positive, values-based language, your brain releases BDNF. This protein physically builds new synapses, strengthens existing ones, and promotes neurogenesis, particularly in the hippocampus, which is vital for learning and memory and is highly susceptible to damage from cortisol.
So changing your inner speech literally waters the garden of your prefrontal cortex while starving the weeds in your amygdala.
That is the biological reality.
I have to ask about the timeline for all this, because this sounds like it must take decades to achieve. If a listener tuning in right now decides to start implementing Mary Jane Coy's NLPR guidelines today, how long until their brain actually physically changes shape?
This is perhaps the most encouraging data point in all the sources. If we look at the clinical trials, particularly the Monson CBT study, these massive structural changes, the shrinking of the amygdala, the thickening of the prefrontal cortex, can be observed on an MRI in as little as 9 to 12 weeks of targeted therapy or consistent, rigorous linguistic practice.
9 weeks.
Roughly 2 to 3 months to physically rewire the hardware of your mind. It requires intense intention, consistency, and a lot of machete hacking through the brush, like you said, but the timeline is surprisingly short.
So what does this all mean? We have covered a massive amount of ground today, moving from linguistics to neuroanatomy to clinical psychology. Let's synthesize this journey. We started by recognizing that we all have a voice that won't shut up. The narrator is a natural, necessary function of our default mode network, communicating through Broca's and Wernicke's areas. We learned that this voice is largely a combination of our own thoughts mixed with the echoes of our past environment, the people who spoke to us during our development.
But we also learned the dark side of that echo chamber. If that narrator gets stuck and turns into a broken record of rumination, self-criticism, and fear, the brain cannot tell the difference between internal words and external threats.
Right, the smoke detector goes off.
Exactly. This constant state of alarm triggers the amygdala, floods the brain with cortisol, and literally physically damages the tissue, shrinking the logical prefrontal cortex and enlarging the fear center.
But the incredible, undeniable news hidden in all these clinical trials is that we are not stuck with the brain we currently have. By using highly specific linguistic rules, like Coy's NLPR guidelines, forcing ourselves to use I statements to stay grounded, ditching the toxic word should to promote autonomy, banning, to keep the logic centers online, and reclaiming our power for makes me statements, we can manually shift our nervous system from a dorsal vagal state of threat to a ventral vagal state of safety.
And the MRI scans prove that in doing so, over the course of just 9 to 12 weeks, we can physically build new neural pathways, increase the gray matter in our executive control centers, release BDNF to fertilize new growth, and literally shrink our brain's fear center back down to size.
I want to read a core philosophy from D. McMillan's notes that really sums this all up beautifully. It says, "The voice inside your head may have a history, but it doesn't have to control your future."
It is a powerful reminder of our own agency. The brain is entirely plastic. It is sitting there, waiting for us to give it new instructions.
While the facts about how our brains react to our own anxiety and self-criticism might be confronting, the facts are the facts. And the most important fact we learned from your sources today is that you have the absolute power to change your physical brain through the words you choose to speak to yourself.
It requires intention, and it is hard work, but the neurological evidence proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that structural change is absolutely possible.
So as we wrap up this massive deep dive into the source material on inner speech, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We spent this entire time talking about how to manage the voices inside your head, how to filter the echo chamber that you inherited from your past. But think about the flip side of that equation. If your inner voice is a mosaic, a collection of the voices of the people who raised you, taught you, and spoke to you when you were growing up, whose inner voice are you currently becoming with the words you choose to speak out loud to them today?
We love you so much, mama. Traumatic brain.